Howdy, and welcome to LeeReads, where I talk about the books I've been reading and enjoying lately. Today I thought it would be fun to talk about some military science fiction, but maybe more introduction to military science fiction. Most of the books I'm talking about today do have their primary setting in a military environment, but in most of these there are some other elements that fuel the story that make it feel a lot more broad and accessible to more people. So if you're someone who hasn't read a lot of military science fiction, these books might be a good place to start. And if you're someone who really loves this subgenre, please give me more recommendations because I want to read more into it. First book on the list, The Light Brigade by Cameron Hurley. This book reads like Starship Troopers meets time hopping. The setup is that our protagonist, a young soldier named Dietz, is a member of the army of one of the corporations. Massive corporations really are the political entities of the time. They hold sway over Earth, and they even control planets like Mars. And they wage wars. And an interesting bit of technology that Dietz's army has is their ability to teleport into battlefields by turning into beams of light, hence the Light Brigade. It's kind of like teleporting. As Dietz embarks on this military campaign, soon Dietz realizes that chronologically they are not experiencing this war the way everyone else is. And it makes this book really fascinating to read. So our main character is moving throughout time in a way they can't necessarily control and trying to put pieces of this overall campaign together. And when they start making decisions on how they personally want to impact this war, you see it play out over different points in time. So it's really fascinating. You kind of have to pay attention as you're reading though. It's not just one you can kind of pick up and maybe read for 10 minutes before bed because you might get lost. I mentioned that it read a little bit like Starship Troopers by Heinlein. Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers is a classic. It's about these highly armored troops that deploy into different war zones to fight the aliens. Now, in the Light Brigade, our characters are facing off against other humans. In Starship Troopers, it's more of the typical we're fighting the alien invaders storyline. Each of them definitely makes commentary on society. I think with the Light Brigade, what Cameron Hurley is talking about as far as corporations and what makes you people feels relevant nowadays. Whereas in Starship Troopers, in order to truly become a citizen and be able to vote and be an active participant in society, you needed to serve in the military first. So it's an interesting viewpoint, these two different authors coming from different eras. You can tell that Cameron Hurley definitely nods to Starship Troopers in this book. If you were going to pick between the two to read, I'd pick this one. My next recommendation is actually a trilogy that is complete. It's the Planet Side trilogy by Michael Mamet. I listened to all three of these by audiobook, and they're definitely binge-worthy. As soon as I finished one, I wanted to pick up the other one. The premise is we have a Lieutenant Colonel Carl Butler who is at the tail end of his career. One of his bosses calls in a favor. There is a missing person, a soldier who is the child of someone else very important in the military. And they want Carl to go investigate what happened to this missing soldier, figure out if they're alive, or find out how they died if they died. The only problem is the soldier has gone missing on a planet that's at the forefront of humans' battle with aliens called the Capins. And Carl Butler has had a bad experience on that particular planet earlier in his career. It's military science fiction because the setting is a military base, the characters are all in the military. The author actually is a retired army officer and brings that authenticity to the story and how the characters talk to each other. But this isn't a story about waging battles, although there are some cool firefights and interesting technology in the story. It's more of the investigative side and how Carl Butler deals with the people around him. Each book in this trilogy gives you what you liked from the first book, but in a different way. So each book in the trilogy is not like a rehashing of the same story in the first book, although there is a continuous thread. I highly recommend the trilogy. They're very fun. I think they would be a great entry point into military science fiction. My next recommendation is Unconquerable Sun by Kate Elliott, which I have already briefly reviewed in my overview of Kate Elliott novels that I really enjoy. This features a military story and more of an epic fleet-wide scope. In this story, the main character has been raised to be a leader, not only with being personable and being able to lead on an individual basis, but also to help coordinate and conduct fleet battles, space fleet battles. So throughout the story, you have some cool interfleet space battles. Another main character, she's a graduate of the military academy, so you get kind of that side of a military story. And then another character is actually the enemy that they're fighting, and this character is a pilot of one of the starships. So you get space battles from like a command level where you're seeing ships on a screen figuring out your tactics, but you also get to see space fights at a more pilot versus pilot level. That's really cool. Again, the focus of Unconquerable Sun isn't about we fight this battle, then we fight this battle. It tells a greater story of loyalty and what it means to try to take power and keep power. It's ultimately about a young woman trying to prove herself to her infamous general mother. My next recommendation is The Expanse series by James S.A. Corey. The first book of the Expanse series is Leviathan Wakes, and the military science fiction aspects aren't quite as heavy in the first book. But in the second book, you begin to get the story from the perspective of a gunnery sergeant in the Mars Army. Also, it is a near future science fiction where Earth and Luna are constantly at odds and on the verge of war with Mars, and they're all constantly on the verge of war with the outer planets and those people who live in the belt. So these different entities' militaries are very important in the story. Plus, our main characters in the story run around on a stolen Martian gunship. Excuse me, they salvaged it, so it's theirs now. And so tactics and these kind of dogfights are prevalent throughout the series, and I think lend a fun flavor to the series. And it's a great way to get a taste of military and science fiction while also getting the other aspects of the story that are really great. You have an investigator searching for a missing child, kind of similar to Planetside, but way different. Really dangerous alien technology wreaking havoc and trying to figure out who is behind it and what they want. And then all of the politics between the inner and the outer planets churning together that just make the Expanse series really interesting to read. And if you're not going to read it, then I highly suggest watching the show because it's great. Dare I say, I may actually like the Expanse show better than Battlestar Galactica? I might. My last recommendation is more of a humorous twist to military science fiction. It's called Mechanical Failure. This story is set from the perspective of someone who served in the military fleets during the 200 years and counting of peace. And so the military that he knows is very lax. There's even beer hour at lunch. No one's really training that hard for any invasions because they've had peace for 200 years and counting. This character gets out of the military and serves as a smuggler for a year, and then events force him back into the military. And suddenly everything is different. Like, people are more serious, there's training, there's risks of spies on the ship, and it's just a good time where our character is one of those incompetent yet competent characters that is maybe viewing the world through a naive lens because they're used to the 200 years of peace, and now that something has changed and there's real danger on the horizon, they just can't quite see it yet, even as they're being put in all these dangerous situations. The humor in the book is very reminiscent of Futurama humor. So if you enjoy the show Futurama and that style of humor, you should definitely check out this book. Then, honorable mention, because they are books of my heart and I will never let them go, the first military science fiction I ever read, the X-Wing Rogue Squadron series in the old Star Wars Expanded Universe that's now no longer considered canon. but these characters will never die. I mean, come on. I do have some other military science fiction I want to check out. The first book at the top of my list is called Velocity Weapon by Megan O'Keefe. And this is a story about a fighter pilot who gets presumably killed in a firefight and then wakes up in the future on an enemy AI ship and then has to figure out not only how to survive, but how to try to fix mistakes that were made in the past. At least that's my understanding of this book. But I also want to venture into reading more hard science fiction, and try out some more military-focused military sci-fi. So if you have any recommendations for me, please tell me what your favorite military sci-fis are. I'd really love to check them out. And if you haven't read any of the ones on my list, they're all highly recommended, and I think you should check them out. I think there's a little something for everybody on this list, whether you want humorous, more an investigation story, more of a grand adventure story, or kind of a time-hopping story. And with that, I just want to remind you not to forget to support your local library, and we'll see you next time. Bye.